Hi there, and thanks for stopping by. This is Jennifer McGuire. This video is part of my Favorite Crafty Things 2015 series. This is a series of videos and blog posts that focus on my favorite products from this year. If you're interested in seeing the series and what I've covered already, and also discount codes and giveaways, you can click here or in the description below to head over to my blog. Okay, so today is all about inks. Now, this is probably the hardest thing to zone in on a favorite because inks are really objective. It depends on the person. Okay, so this is how I think about it. Inks are kind of like shoes. What one person wants from a shoe is different than what another person wants from a shoe. Now, I like comfort and a little bit of style. Then I have a good friend of mine who wants as high of a heel as possible. We want completely different things out of shoes. So it's hard to say that pick one shoe that would work for both of us. It's really hard to find that shoe that works for everyone. And it's the same thing for inks. Some people want super crisp images right away. Some people just want the results to end up being nice and solid. Some people want inks that don't stain their stamps. Some people want inks that will work on any surface. I mean, you could go on and on about the things that you could possibly want from an ink. Now, another thing that goes into it is what paper you're using. It's kind of like what socks you wear with your shoes. Like I find I can't wear Converse without some nice socks with them. But if I wear those socks, I'm really happy with how they feel. So it's the same thing with paper with inks. If you're using like a poor quality cardstock, it's going to be hard to find any kind of ink that will give you good results. If you're using a high quality cardstock, my guess is you could have good results with a lot of different inks. And also you got to remember, everybody walks different too. Everybody's foot is a little bit different, and it's the same thing with stamping. Everybody stamps different, and that goes into what ink is best for you also. So in this video, I'm just going to focus on what I find based on my experience and with the cardstocks I use, which inks are best, and I'll talk about the properties of each, and maybe that will help you decide which is right for you. But please keep in mind that it's like shoes. You can't just ask somebody, hey, what's the best ink, and get a good answer. It always depends on the paper, the person, the stamps, everything. There's a lot that goes into it. Also keep in mind that there are a few different ink types out there, such as dye and pigment ink. Now, I did a video a while ago that does a really in-depth comparison in ink types. If you haven't seen it, be sure to watch it. You can click here to find it or in my YouTube description below. In this video, I'll talk a little bit about the different types, but you might want to check that out if you need more information. And I should probably mention here that I'm sorry for another long video, but I really wanted to get a lot of information in. Before we dive into the different colored inks, let's talk about the basic inks. Now, the black ink pad that I have been using since my beginning in stamping is Hero Art's black dye ink. This has been around for a very long time. I had the same ink pad for like 10 or 12 years, and I finally just replaced it. They last a long time and really don't need re-inking if you just put the lid on it when you're not using it. Now, this is a dye ink, so it absorbs into the paper very quickly, and so you don't have to worry about smearing it. I use this black ink for almost all of my black stamping. The only thing I can't use it for is for using it with Copics. You cannot use this ink with Copics because it will bleed. We'll talk about Copics later. There aren't many inks that work with that. But I use this for watercolor. I use this for colored pencils. Anytime I need to just stamp a black sentiment, I find the results are nice and crisp. And again, it dries right away, so I don't have to worry about smearing it. So let's stamp this so you can see that's nice and dark black. And by the way, some people ink their stamp by taking the stamp to the ink pad, and some people ink their stamp by taking the ink pad to the stamp. I do a mix of both, but you might want to play around with what gives you better results. That's another thing that helps with getting a good solid image. Okay, so I stamped that. That's instantly dry. I can rub my finger over it. It'll be fine. And then I have a nice black crisp image. Now, one thing is this ink, as many other dye inks, will stain your clear stamps if your clear stamps are high quality. Don't worry about the staining. I think it's really not something to worry about because that is a sign that you have a high quality stamp. If that bothers you, there are some inks that don't stain as much, and I'll mention those in the video. Another black ink that's great for basic black stamping, you can use it with watercolor and just nice, crisp, dark sentiments, is VersaFine Onyx Black. Now, you can't use this with Copics again, but you can use it for everything else. This is different than the Hero Arts dye ink in that this is a fast-drying pigment ink. So pigment inks kind of sit on top of the paper, so they stay wet a little bit longer. So when you stamp this, you want to be careful not to touch it right away. That's one of the reasons I don't use it as often, and also I don't like that the lid is attached, but some people love that. I just find it's best to flap it back on itself. But if you rub it with your finger by accident, you will smear it. It's hard to see in the video, but that has like a gray cloud around it now because I smeared it. So you can either let it dry on its own or heat set it, or this is the nice thing, since this is a pigment ink and it stays wet for a bit, you could put some clear embossing powder on it and have a nice, crisp, heat embossed image. There's the comparison. The top left is the Hero Arts dye ink. The top right is the VersaFine Black Onyx ink. And I get great results with both. But if you find, you might want to try out both and see which works for you. You'll see a lot of people using both of these. Now, the Onyx Black, the VersaFine Black, it doesn't stain your stamp as much. So that is another perk of it. So those are the two black inks that I find that I reach for the most. And by the way, if you want something black heat embossed, I, instead of using black embossing powder, recommend using the VersaFine Black ink, the one that I show here on the top right, and add clear embossing powder to it, and you'll get a great, sharp, black heat embossed image. Okay, now if you're looking for an ink that works with Copic markers, I use the My Favorite Things Black Hybrid ink. I think this is the darkest, crispest black ink there is that is Copic marker friendly. That's a tongue twister. Copic marker friendly. And this is the one that I reach for often. There are lots of colors in this ink line. I know a lot of people like this particular ink line. Now keep in mind, hybrid inks, this is a hybrid ink, and hybrid inks are kind of in between a dye and pigment ink. That's kind of a simplified way of saying it, but you want to make sure it's completely dry. So you want to heat set that a little bit or let it dry on its own before you bring the Copic markers to it, and you don't have to worry at all about it bleeding. So that's what I use the My Favorite Things Black Hybrid ink for. Okay, so let's now cover white inks. There are two white inks that I recommend. The first is Hero Arts Unicorn White Pigment Ink. Now the Simon Says Stamp White Pigment Ink and the Lawn Fawn Yeti White Pigment Ink are the same ink from the same manufacturer, so any of those will work also. Now the Hero Arts Unicorn White Pigment Ink is the brightest white pigment ink I've found. Now this is a pigment ink because remember, pigment ink kind of sits on top of the paper. It's opaque, so you want that because you don't want the white to absorb in or it would get lost on a dark colored cardstock. So here you can see that ink sits on top of the stamp. You can really make sure that your stamp is clearly white and perfectly inked before stamping on the paper. And you'll see you get a nice white image on the colored cardstock. Now this is not going to give you a vivid, perfectly perfect white stamped image. If you want that, go ahead and put some white embossing powder on this and then heat set it. And then you get a great white crisp image. But this white pigment ink is great for techniques. I have so many videos showing techniques using that white pigment ink. I can't recommend it enough. Another white ink that I recommend is the StazOn Cotton White ink. Now this is a completely different type of ink. This is a solvent ink. Now there are a lot of different properties about solvent inks, but really what you need to know is that you can stamp this on slick or smooth surfaces. So you can stamp this on, say, transparency, and it will dry on there, whereas like a pigment or dye ink really wouldn't. Now this ink is a little bit different also in that it needs to be re-inked pretty often. I don't re-ink my other ink pads often at all, but the StazOn, you do need to re-ink more often, and that's why it comes with a re-inker. So this is a very thick white ink that I'm putting on here, and it comes with this little tool to help spread the ink into the ink pad. I just did a quick re-inking here to show you. And then there's also a clear plastic lid inside the outside lid that you want to keep on there. That's to help protect your ink pad. But these ink pads can last you a long time. Okay, so now I wanted to show you how you can stamp this onto a slick surface. So I'm going to stamp it onto a piece of transparency. You can save any kind of clear transparency from packaging and use it on projects with this ink. There are other colors of StazOn, but I really only use the white and occasionally the black. But check out that bright, vivid white image you get on that transparency. Now you don't want to touch this right away. It takes some time to dry. And also if you mess up, you can clean that off completely with an alcohol swab. Now I will say that you can also stamp this ink on paper. It will be pretty bright white. It's not super crisp, but it is a pretty bright white image. So it's another option for stamping on paper. Now, StazOn is tricky though. You want to make sure you clean StazOn off your stamp, and it won't come off with like a baby wipe or a cloth. You really need a cleaner. There is a StazOn cleaner, but I was told by a clear stamp manufacturer not to use StazOn cleaner on your clear stamp. So I try to avoid that. Instead, I use the one stamp cleaner that I use for absolutely all of my inks. You really only need one, and that is what I use is the Hero Arts Ultra Clean. This is safe for clear stamps. So what I do is I use that along with the Hero Arts Scrubber Pad. You could use the Ultra Clean with just a cloth if you wanted to, that'd be fine. I spray the Ultra Clean on one side of the scrubber. I scrub my stamp into that, and then I scrub it onto the other side to kind of clean it off, and then I wipe it clean, and that takes the StazOn off your stamps. Be sure to not let that StazOn dry on your ink on your stamps. You really don't want that to happen, but you can use this cleaner to take StazOn off your clear or cling or rubber stamps. So be sure to get a good cleaner if you are going to get that StazOn ink. Okay, so there is one ink that I recommend to everyone, no matter what type of shoe you like to wear, no matter whether you're a beginning stamper or advanced stamper. I highly recommend the Versamark ink pad. It's a very unique ink pad. It's a watermark stamp pad. Basically, it is a clear, sticky ink, and there are many ways that you can use this ink. The most obvious and simple is to just stamp it on a dark colored cardstock, and it gives you a tone-on-tone watermark look. So you can create a beautiful background with this. Now, the great thing about Versamark ink is that it's kind of a type of a pigment ink that stays wet for a while, so you can go and add embossing powder to this. And actually, it's so good for embossing that you don't have to do it right away. You could wait a couple minutes, and it still usually is good to add that embossing powder too. So this is the ink. Whenever I want to use any kind of embossing powder, I use Versamark ink for any embossing powder, except I don't use black embossing powder. If I want a black heat embossed image, I do what I mentioned earlier. I stamp with the VersaFine black ink and put on clear powder. But otherwise, no matter what kind of embossed image I want, I use Versamark, and then I use a colored embossing powder. So I just find that gives the best, most crisp results. And by the way, if you want some tips for heat embossing, I will link here to my heat embossing video from my favorite crafty things of 2014. Not much has changed, so I'm not doing another video this year on that. So be sure to check that out if you want more information on heat embossing. Really, it's all about getting a good quality embossing powder in your Versamark ink pad. Now, before we get into the regular ink pad colors, I wanted to mention one more unique ink pad. Now, this one's been around for a long time. I actually used to have it. I donated it, and then I ended up buying them again because I wanted to use them for a project, and now I can't get enough. They're the Kaleidacolor ink pads. These are gradient colored ink pads like a rainbow. Now, the ink pad comes with a bunch of tiny little ink pads separated, and what you do is you press the little slider on the left in, and it puts them all together. It keeps them separated so the inks don't run into each other. So when you're ready to stamp, you just push it in to push them together, and then you can do your stamping. And it gives you this gradient of color of different shades. There's a few available. I use this blue and green one for a lot of my work projects, like for stamping my logo that you see here and creating a bunch of different cards to send out to a lot of people. You can also get a empty ink pad, so you can use your own reinkers to create whatever gradient of colors that you like. Now, this is a dye ink, but I have actually gotten an empty one of these ink pads and put the reinkers from a pigment ink pad on it, and it worked fine for me. So you can really use whatever reinkers you have to fill up each of these colors and different things, and you can get a fun gradient look. So it's just something fun and unique I wanted to mention. Okay, now it's time to get into colored inks that you can use for everyday stamping. Now, there are two basic inks that I reach for personally the most often, and that is a dye ink and a pigment ink. There are also chalk and hybrid inks, which I use sometimes, and I will link to a video here that does a more in-depth comparison. It talks about those inks also. But in this video, I'm going to talk about for colored inks, dye inks, and pigment inks. Now, there are a bunch of different dye inks out there and a bunch that I use, so you'll see a lot of those in this video, and that's what I'm piling up here over on the left. There are also a couple of pigment inks that I use, and that's what you see over on the right. I mostly use Mama Elephant and Avriel. Now, these two inks are very, very different. Dye inks that you see on the left do what kind of the name says. It dyes into the paper. Pigment inks, which you see over to the right, are a pigment that kind of sits on top of the paper. That's kind of a simplified, very rudimentary explanation of the two. There's more to it, but that's really what you need to know. The dye ink dyes into the paper. It's a translucent ink, so when you stamp it, it's going to soak into the paper, and it gives you a quick drying result. Now dye inks, again, remember I said it kind of absorb into the paper. I put some on my finger here, and when I go to wipe it off, it stains my finger. Now the pigment ink on the right kind of sits on top of the paper, so it'll clean off my finger and off my stamps very nicely. So you can see the difference here. The dye ink stained my finger. That's okay. It's just something to keep in mind. Dye inks usually have a raised, kind of firm felt pad, whereas the pigment ink on the right has a foam pad that's very soft. So it's just two different types of ink. Some people love dye inks, some people love pigment inks. I happen to like both, but I use dye inks more because I have more of them. Here I've stamped with the dye ink, and that will dry pretty quickly, and I can wipe the stamp off. Almost all dye inks do stain clear stamps, but not all. It just depends on the particular ink. Some dye inks take a little bit of time to get really absorbed in the paper and get even and good coverage, and I'll talk about that in this video. But that's something to keep in mind with dye inks. They dry very quickly. Most people use dye inks, but not all. Okay, now here is a pigment ink. The nice thing about pigment ink is since it's kind of a little bit juicier, almost kind of like more like a paint, and it's opaque, it sits on the stamp so you can really see when you're inking it to make sure you have good coverage on your stamp before you stamp it. Now, if I go and take my finger to this, I will smear this because this is a pigment ink that kind of sits on top of the paper and takes a little bit of time to dry. It does clean off my stamp quite nicely without staining it. Now, since this takes time to dry, I can add embossing powder to this, like clear embossing powder, and get a nice, colorful, raised and embossed image. So that's one of the great things about colored pigment inks. So it's just two different things. I recommend getting a small ink pad of a dye ink and of a pigment ink and trying them out and seeing which one works for you. Again, a lot of this is personal preference. Let's look at colored dye inks. Now there are several that I recommend and use. The one that I use most often is the Hero Arts dye ink. There are the shadow and mid-tone inks. It's the same thing, just some are light and some are dark. I use these most because the most colors are available from the Hero Arts because they've been around the longest. Since then, Simon Says Stamp and W+9 have come out with the dye ink that's made by the same people and it's the same formulation. So you'll get the same properties from them, and there's beautiful colors in those lines also. Now these inks are a little bit different than other dye inks in that they take a little bit of time to even out. It'll be splotchy and uneven at first, but it will dry to give you a solid image if you're using a high quality cardstock. If you find yours aren't evening out, it might be that you're not using a great quality cardstock, or it might be that you're using a light color. Not all light inks smooth out perfectly. It's just something that's difficult with light colored inks. In all of my white cardstock stamping, especially in this video and everything I do, I always use Neenah White Classic Crest cardstock because it's super high quality. It comes in 80 and 110 pounds. I highly recommend using a good quality cardstock. It's nice and smooth. So here I'm going to stamp it so you can see what it looks like when you first stamp it, and then it dries to look like what you have on the left. Again, I love these inks, and I know many people who do, but I also know a handful of people who don't have success with these inks. They don't really get a nice even coverage, but again, it's like shoes. Everybody's a little bit different. A newer ink to the industry is Lawn Fawn dye ink. It's made by the same manufacturer as the inks I just showed you, but I do find that it's very similar results, but I do find that it's a little bit more solid right away. I do recommend these inks for beginners. I think it's a great quality, solid ink. I think you get pretty solid images every time you stamp, no matter what colors you use. So I will link to a video where I talk more about the qualities of these inks, and you can check that out if you want to. It'll be linked here in the YouTube description below. Another new ink line is this Ranger Basic Dye ink line. Now I'm going to tell you that I believe that this gives the best results of any inks that I have ever tried. However, there are not many colors just yet, just a few basic colors, but the results are fantastic. Check this out. Right away when stamping it, it's dry right away, crisp right away, solid right away, and I think it's beautiful. I've never found a great red ink, and check this out. I just think it's gorgeous. I really recommend this Ranger dye ink. If you're just starting out, give this one a try. I find all the colors are great, and I'm really hoping that they add more colors to the line very soon. So that will help. But, you know, again, it doesn't have all the colors. So you could get these and then mix in some of the other inks too to have more colors. And again, I have a video on this ink so you can see more of it too. Another great dye ink that came out this year is from Altenew. Now, this gives great results, but what is really impressive about the Altenew ink line is that they come out in like collections of 3 or 4 inks. So you have like a light, medium, dark, and super dark of the same color. So it's great for stamp layering or really planning your cards out. So if you like inks like that, where you have like a collection of light, medium, and darks, definitely check out the Altenew. They're beautiful colors, great for stamp layering, and they do have ink cubes. So if you prefer to save some money, you can get ink cubes of this particular ink also. Okay, so next up, my favorite things. They have had a dye ink line for some time now, and I liked the ink. However, they have recently changed their manufacturers, and the ink pad is completely different now. So they're going to be replacing their inks. And the new ink, I love. It is fantabulous. So here's the thing. I've just got these. These are newer inks. They're just coming out. And I've been playing with them a little bit, and I cannot believe how solid they stamp. They stamp solid and crisp and beautiful, despite if you use a light color or a dark color. So you haven't seen me use these in videos yet. I got to get more colors and I'll start using them. But I really think this is an ink to watch out for because the results are gorgeous. So be sure to check out the My Favorite Things dye ink, the newer ink pads, just beautiful. Now, some ink lines, like their lighter colors are better than their darker colors or vice versa. I found with this ink line, I had success with both the light and the dark colors. And I also found that it really didn't stain my stamps too much, which is a great perk also. Now, if you like pigment inks, and again, I'll link to a video that talks more about them, I would go for the Mama Elephant Creative Color Pigment Ink or the Avriel Pigment Ink. They're very similar and both good quality pigment inks that are available in beautiful colors. There is another type of ink that I highly recommend for all stampers, and this is the Distress ink. I don't actually use Distress ink much for basic stamping. I use it for techniques. This is a unique ink that reacts when it comes in contact with water, so you can do amazing techniques with Distress inks. It also blends beautifully, so if you use a mini ink blending tool, which you'll see there on the right, I highly recommend that tool, by the way. When you use this, you can get beautiful blended backgrounds, just gorgeous. You can get blending with other inks also with that inking tool, but Distress inks blend beautifully. I highly recommend these. So many things that you can do with them. Now, people ask often if you should get the full ink pad, which you see on the right, or the mini Distress ink cubes. If you're just starting out, I highly recommend getting the mini ink cubes because it's a good quality ink. It doesn't matter. Instead, you can save your money and get the re-inkers because the re-inkers are great for techniques also. I don't usually get re-inkers for my inks, but I do for Distress inks because I can use them for many things, and I like to keep these ink pads juicy so that I can use those ink blending tools. Again, I recommend the minis for new people. Another reason that I like the minis is you can take your foam off of your ink blending tool and put the foam inside the bottom of your mini Distress ink pad and store it there. And whenever you need that ink blending tool foam, you can just take it right off and put it onto your inking tool. Also, I think that the mini Distress ink tin that you see here is really handy for storing this. And in fact, you can put any of your mini ink cubes from other ink lines into these tins. Great for storage. I will link here to a video that talks more about the properties of Distress ink. And keep in mind, you'll see me using the full ink pads in my videos because that's what I had originally. I have a storage unit built into my desk for them, so that's why you see me using them. But if you're just starting out, save your money and go for the mini ink pads instead. I really think they are handy to have. There's one more thing I wanted to mention for inks, and that is to have an ink swatch book. I highly recommend creating some sort of ink swatch book. I've tried many over the years, and I never really found one that I liked until I started this method. So basically, these are coin protector pages. They're like 2-inch square pockets. Very inexpensive, easy to find. I'll link to the ones that I use. And I created a bunch of downloads for a lot of the popular inks. So all you have to do is go over to my blog. I'll give a link here. And you print the downloads, cut them up, and then you stamp a little bit of that ink color onto the swatch. And then you can create your own ink swatches for whatever inks you may have. I will be updating my ink swatch downloads again over the holidays, so stay tuned for that. But I'll link to a video that shows you how to do this and the free downloads. This has really been handy for me because I can quickly flip through and find what I need. And you can also grab like one of the colors and then take it over to another color section and see what it matches and so on. Now I divide mine up by dye and pigment inks in here, and I put my hybrid and chalk in the pigment ink section, but that helps me, but you can divide it up by whatever makes sense for you. I keep these pages on 3 separate little rings instead of putting it into a binder. I like this because it makes it lighter weight. I can flip around through the book much faster, and I can hang it on a hook in my cabinet by one of those little rings. But you could put this in a binder or an album of some sort if you wanted to. Now, you really don't need these many inks, by the way. This is my job, so I have a lot of these inks, but you don't need many. Just pick a few different lines that work for you and go with that. Okay, so I apologize once again for the long video. I just had so much to cover, more than I thought. If you are interested in the products I talk about or the videos I talk about, they're linked below in my YouTube description, but I do encourage you to head over to my blog where I'll have multiple sources for the products, and I'll have discount codes in ways. To find my blog post, you just click on the top left up here. There are 3 other things linked in the center here. The first one takes you to My Favorite Crafty Things hub, where you can find everything I've done so far. The middle one takes you to an ink comparison video, and the one on the right takes you to another video about the Lawn Fawn and Ranger inks. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon for more of My Favorite Crafty Things.